to subsidize tuition for private and religious schools, again, with no accountability. Time is running out to stop this, which is why we're pulling everybody in here on this Friday afternoon. It just passed through the House. It will, in short order, be brought to the Senate, where there will be an opportunity for public testimony, and then it goes to the governor. So we are asking everybody listening to this and hearing this today to reach out to your senators, ask them to stop this dangerous proposal, and reach out to the governor and ask him to veto it if it reaches his desk. The governor made a promise at the beginning of the session. He said he would not sign any voucher or quote school choice bill that was not fair, reasonable, transparent, and accountable. House Bill 93 is none of those things. So please ask him to stand by that promise and veto this bill if it should reach his desk. This is not coming from the people of Idaho. A survey was done by BSU that showed 14.9% of Idahoans thought that this is something we should be prioritizing with our tax dollars. This is being driven by out-of-state billionaires and special interests who have threatened all legislators and those who stand in their way and stand up for public education. And I want to turn the microphone over to someone who knows firsthand what happens when you take on these out-of-state special interests. My good friend, Republican former Representative Julie Yamamoto.
So I'll start off by saying that I usually aggravate people by this comment alone. I am as conservative as anyone needs to be. I am a Republican, but when I read the GOP platform, I don't recognize my tribe anymore. And I'm going to keep to just this and say it has been a long-standing conservative principle that if you wanted something and you could afford it, have at it. But if you can't afford it, you don't get to put your hand in somebody else's pocket and take that money so that you can have what you think you want and you need. And when we talked about out of state, it's in state too. I was at a Republican GOP fundraiser, and the chairman, Moon, pushed me in front of someone and said, "You need to talk to her." And the fellow said, "I want you to know that I put out $750,000 to candidates who will deliver me a voucher. What do you think of that?" And I said, "Well, that's a lot of money." And I walked away. But what I wish I would have said is that, you know what, if you would have put that money out for people to have $5,000, you could have paid for 150 kids to have that $5,000 to have the school choice that you believe that they deserve. And I'm thinking he'd probably say to me, "Well, I don't want to have to pay that every year." And I would say, "I know." And then I would say, I was an elementary principal, a high school principal, I opened a charter school, I'm still on the board of charter schools. Do I believe in choice? Do I believe that every kid deserves to have an education that fits them? I sure do. And if Idaho is behind $66 million for special ed right now, $50 million still doesn't fill the bill.
Yes.
That's concerning, isn't it? If we're really saying that we care about every child, then let's put our money where our mouth is, and let's fund the public schools. I can't even begin to tell you how many parents came to me and their child wasn't in special ed, didn't have a 504, but had specific needs that they wished that we could meet. And I had teachers. I'm telling you right now, I never met a teacher who thought the public schools were perfect. Not a one. They had all kinds of ways that we could better meet the needs of students. $50 million wouldn't do it, but it would be nice. It would be hopeful. So if we really believe that the public schools aren't meeting those needs, well then let's set up whatever it was you want accountability-wise. I'm good with the parent survey. To say, we're gonna take that $50 million, and parents, you get to tell us what those needs are, and to the best of our ability, we're gonna do that. And I'm just gonna tell you right now, a lot of parents will say, I want a one-on-one aid for my student because they have a hard time staying focused. Some teachers would say, yep, that's a great idea, and some teachers would say, that's not a great idea. That child stands out, that child never learns how they need to self-monitor, how they need to be a self-directed learner. So you have to count on a partnership between the student, the parent, and the school to come up with a plan that works. And I'm just here to tell you, did I see eye to eye with every teacher? Some of them rose up and called me blessed, and others called me names I will not repeat here. But here's the deal. The biggest complaint I got is that I was child-centered. I'll take that one too. So I want to I try really hard not to be snarky because I just don't think it's how we need to be. So this remark is meant to not sound snarky, and I just think it's probably going to anyway. But to have 28 brave people in the House of Representatives who have read their Constitution and understand what it says about what is the proper role of government in regard to educating our youth, I thank God for them. It is not easy to stand up against all of those voices who are telling you you need to wear the team jersey, you don't care about individual kids, you need to please this person or that person, it's not going to go well for you in the next primary. I get all of that. But do we actually really care about every child in the state of Idaho? I'm going to say it again. If we do, then come on, Idaho, let's put our money where our mouth is. Let's stop starving the public school and to being happy that calling us failing when we're punching way above our weight on every measure, including NAEP, and people who are reading that, we just need to talk. You need to understand what it's telling you. And I won't bore you with that, just to say, we have an opportunity. Governor Little has made it his legacy that we are going to be a state that values education, public education. And I think we need to hold ourselves accountable to that. And I would ask that you would do what is ever in your power to ask the people that make the vote to think long and hard about this Pandora's box they are about to open. And we can see what has happened in every other state. And I always think Idaho's the best too. But to think we're going to do it differently, I just don't see that being a rational, reasonable argument. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much to Representative Yamamoto. Next up we have longtime former president and CEO of Idaho Business for Education, Rod Grammer, who's going to talk from the business perspective about what has
Thank you everyone for being here today. I've spent the better part of several years researching vouchers, what it's done in other states, and what's happening in Idaho with House Bill 93 is part of the playbook, where they start off small, like the Horman-Din-Hartog bill, and over time it grows and it grows and grows until it becomes virtually a universal voucher, regardless of family income. In states like Ohio, Indiana, Arizona, Florida, it's costing taxpayers in those states hundreds of millions of dollars, and in the case of Florida, billions of dollars, to provide vouchers to families to attend private religious schools. Now, many people think that the whole purpose of vouchers is to move students from so-called failing schools to private religious schools. But we know that they don't succeed academically when they do that. But that's not the point. In all these states, between 2/3 and 70% of every student that gets a voucher has never attended a public school. Vouchers have become the most expensive government handout in the history of states. In Idaho, we can ill afford that. We rank at the bottom of states that spend per student, money per student. Our teachers still lag many of the surrounding states in salary, which puts us in a non-competitive situation, losing teachers to other states. And the third thing is we have $1.2 billion worth of school facilities. Now where this ends up is like in Ohio, where they are planning to spend millions of dollars to build and renovate religious schools in the state of Ohio. There is no end to what happens here. In Arizona, they're running a huge budget deficit in part because of the universal voucher bill, and they're cutting very important road projects and even a $133 million water project in the third most thirsty state in the United States. If this were a business that was not having enough money to run its own business, why would any business go out and buy 2 more, maybe 3 more businesses and think they're gonna work their way to prosperity? That's what we're trying to do with vouchers. We have a school system that's underfunded, and we want to go out and fund 3 new systems: homeschool, private school, and religious school, and micro schools. We just don't have the money. I just want to make one more comment in the time that I have. We have 2 bills, maybe 3 bills now. Everybody has read these bills. Everybody knows what they do. One has passed the House. I think it's time for the governor to be transparent with the people of Idaho and this legislature. I want him to tell the people of Idaho which of these bills meet his 4 standards and which of these bills don't. And the reason that's important is because if a bill such as 93, which I don't think meets any of them, legislators still have time to go back and fix that. But the worst scenario is that this ends up on his desk. Because of pressure from folks upstairs, he feels compelled to sign it. And then write a signing document that reads like it's a veto statement. So the governor has time now to let everybody know, especially the people of Idaho, whose 314,000 kids go to public schools, what he thinks about this legislation. So I think it's very important for him to go on the record and say, this bill doesn't meet it, this bill does, this bill doesn't. So I call upon the governor to be transparent with the people of Idaho and lawmakers and tell us what he thinks. Do these meet his standards? We have a vote in the House today. So we know that if the governor feels like if this bill reaches his desk and he doesn't feel like it meets his 4 standards, he has a veto-proof House that will sustain his veto. So that should not be a consideration as he looks at this bill. So I hope Governor Little does not hold his powder until a bill ends up on his desk. I think now is the time for him to give the legislature some more direct input on what he's expecting. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like to welcome our next speaker, who is an educator and is in fact the NEA's Republican Educator Caucus Chair for the Western States, Alicia Purdy.
A voucher by any other name is still a voucher, whether it's an ESA or a tax credit. It all has the same effect, and it is not fiscally conservative. As a Republican, I recognize, just as Mr. Granger stated earlier, that other states that have implemented these vouchers are all having to raise taxes. If we're in a fiscally conservative state, that is the last thing we want to see. But beyond that, we sit here and talk about the students that are not in the upper brackets that cannot afford to go to these private schools. Problem is, Princeton University did a study recently in the past couple of years that said that in the states that have implemented vouchers, on average, those private schools in those states have raised the rates of their tuition on 24% on average. That still means that the people that could not afford private schools before still cannot provide private school for their students. That is not changing the state for anybody. It is just paying for putting private dollars into public dollars, into private pockets. That's not what we're here for. We need to make sure that we are following our Constitution of Article 9 that says that we are going to provide common schools for all students, not for just those who can afford it. So I hope that we will all stand together, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or somewhere in between. Be sure and reach out to our legislators and let them know what our concerns are and how this accountability, there's such a lack of accountability in this bill. If we're going to be comparing apples and apples, that's one thing, but we're comparing apples and oranges because public schools have to accept all students, special ed, EL, 504s. We have to accept everyone, behaviors. It does not matter, they are all welcome. Private schools do not. Private schools can take anybody they wish and not who they don't wish. They do not have to take the same testing that we have to take in public schools. They are not held to the same curriculum. They do not have to have background checks for their educators. There's so many differences, and that accountability directly affects our students. And that's what we're all here for, our students. So please stand with me and let our legislators know where our priorities stand. Thank you.
I would like to welcome two more staunch conservatives up to the microphone. We have Superintendent Stoney Winston from the Fruitland School District and Superintendent Norman Stewart from the Mercy School District, who will address you sequentially.
Thank you and good afternoon. My name is Stoney Winston and I serve as a superintendent of Fruitland School District. Today I stand before you to strongly oppose House Bill 93 and any effort to divert public tax dollars to private education through vouchers or tax credits. Idaho's public schools are underfunded. Currently, the more realistic number is we're underfunded by $80 million in special education. On top of that, we have a 1.2 billion, that's billion with a B, backlog in public school facility maintenance events, maintenance even after House Bill 521 funding last year. Our students are learning in buildings with failing infrastructure. Yet, instead of addressing these urgent needs, there are proposals to shift public tax dollars to private schools. Every dollar sent to private schools is a dollar taken away from public education. Public schools educate over 90% of Idaho students. Yet, they're forced to rely on levies just to maintain our basic operations. Meanwhile, private schools can pick and choose their students and are not required to provide these services, like transportation, meals, or special education. This is not about choice, it's about fairness. Responsibility of public funds should serve the public interest. Other states have implemented voucher programs, have seen ballooning costs without improved outcomes. We cannot afford to make these same mistakes in Idaho. Our priority must be to fully fund public education, investing in teachers, school facilities, and student programs to ensure that every child, regardless of background, has the opportunity to succeed. Furthermore, we can consider long-term consequences of underfunding public schools. Schools are not just where students learn, especially in rural Idaho. In rural Idaho, public schools are the heart of the communities. Strong public schools drive economic growth. They prepare a future workforce, and they build and grow a great citizenry. When we fail to invest in public education, we're not just harming the students of today, we're harming Idaho in the future. We also need to acknowledge the disparities that exist between the urban and the rural school districts. Rural districts in particular do not have the luxury of multiple educational options. So diverting tax dollars to private institutions disproportionately harms the rural students who rely solely on their public schools for the education, extracurricular activities, and support services. Continuing to underfund and taking money away from schools only widens the gap in opportunity. We have the responsibility to ensure every child, no matter the zip code, no matter the income level, and no matter the ability, has access to high quality education. Instead of sending taxpayer money to schools that can selectively admit students, let's commit to strengthening the schools, the public schools, that welcome and serve all children. I urge our leaders to stand with Idaho Public Schools and reject House Bill 93 and any other attempt to divert taxpayer dollars to private education. The future of our state depends on strong, well-funded public schools that serves every child. We must invest in our students, our teachers, and our communities. Idaho's future depends on it.
I should be able to just say ditto because well, good afternoon. My name is Norm Stewart. I'm superintendent for the Marsing School District, and Marsing is in Hawaii County, and definitely a rural setting. Before I begin, I do want to acknowledge and express my respect for Representative Wendy Horman and Senator Lori Den Hortog. While we disagree on this issue, I appreciate their efforts to try to expand choice. That said, I'm here today to strongly oppose House Bill 93, the tax credit program that redirects much needed public dollars away from Idaho's already underfunded public education into private, unregulated educational institutions. This bill creates a tax benefit for the privileged at the expense of the Idaho's rural communities and working class, including those in Hawaii County. Public schools are already underfunded. Idaho's Constitution and state laws clearly require the state to provide a free public education to all students. Yet, our public schools remain underfunded. Educators across the state struggle with insufficient funds for teacher salaries, for special education, for transportation for rural communities, and then for critical mental health and student support services. Meanwhile, House Bill 93 diverts up to $50 million of public funds to private schools, which are not held to the same accountability standards as public institutions. This bill directly contradicts Idaho's constitutional obligation to adequately fund public education. This is a tax credit for the privileged. Let's be clear, this is not about school choice. Idaho already offers one of the most diverse educational systems in the country with options for public education, which includes traditional, charter, magnet, and even online schools. We also have private schools. We have homeschooling opportunities, as well as dual enrollment opportunities for families that want flexibility. Instead, this bill forces Hawaii County taxpayers to fund private education for families for a more affluent urban area like the Treasure Valley. It allows privileged families to receive tax credits to subsidize private school tuition while rural schools like the Marsing School District, where over 65% of our families qualify for free and reduced lunch and are left with fewer resources and increasing student needs. House Bill 93 lacks accountability for private and even the homeschooling system. Unlike public schools, private institutions can reject students based on academic abilities, income levels, or even disability status. They do not have to report the student outcomes or adhere to the state curriculum standards. They can increase tuition to ensure that only certain families can afford to attend, something that has happened in other states that have also passed similar tax credit and voucher bills. Furthermore, House Bill 93 does incentivize homeschooling for financial reasons rather than educational ones. A low-income family with multiple children could potentially receive more financial backing through tax credits than they could earn in wages, leading a system where financial hardship, not educational philosophy, drives homeschool decisions. And meanwhile, these students often return to public schools and high school lacking proficiency, while public schools are still held accountable for their performance. So in conclusion, parents should always have the choice of where to educate their kids. But public dollars should remain in public schools, where accountability, transparency, and equal access for all students is the standard for Idaho. Taxpayers deserve responsible investment in our children's future, not an unchecked system that benefits the few while further burdens are already underfunded for underfunded public schools. For that reason, I really urge our legislative lawmakers to oppose House Bill 93 and any of the other voucher bills that may come before us, and stand up for students, teachers, and families who rely on our public education system every day.
Thank everyone so much. That was powerful. I want to invite up our next speaker, Alexis Morgan, the president of Idaho's PTA.
All right, we all love kids. The sponsors of this bill on vouchers love kids. I'm the president of Idaho PTA. We have volunteers all around the state of Idaho who are focused on helping the lives of our Idaho kids. We all love kids, but let's not use that sentiment of loving our kids for a reason to pass crappy legislation. House Bill 93 does not meet the standards set by Governor Little. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Let's talk kindergarten. Idaho's kindergartners right now only get 25% of their schooling paid for. House Bill 93 calls for 100% of non-public, meaning private school kindergartners, to be paid for. This bill says that private school kindergartners will receive 100%. That's not fair. That's not fair at all. Let's talk transportation. House Bill 93 says the government will pay parents to drive their kids to and from private school. Just know that the average Idahoan receives 0 reimbursement for school transportation. That's not fair, and it's not transparent. How is the government going to account for our public funds used for driving kids to and from private school? Okay, there's a couple more that just make 0 sense that I'm going to tell you about. They want the Idaho State Tax Commission, who are experts on Idaho taxes, to monitor non-public school programs and assess for student growth. That doesn't really line up for me. And wait, there is one thing in the bill to monitor satisfaction. It's called the Parent Satisfaction and Engagement Survey. And the purpose of the survey is to make sure that parents are happy with their choice of non-public school. House Bill 93 does not care about how those funds are spent, but they want to make sure you're definitely happy with how you spent your funds. These 4 things alone that are within House Bill 93, although the makers of House Bill 93 love kids probably just as much as I do, this is flawed legislation and it does not hit the mark. Now, we can have a conversation on how we can offer more choice. More than the 9 choices that are already existing in Idaho that help Idaho stand out as an education leader in school choice. That's right, Idaho is a national leader in education school choice. And we can have conversations around offering other opportunities for kids, like we already do with the Empowering Parent Grant. I traveled around the state last summer and fall and met with parents all over, all the corners of the state. Just so you know, parents were not talking about tax credits and they didn't mention vouchers. They spoke about technology in schools and in their homes. Parents want to have real conversations about how to improve our schools for our kids. But this isn't it. House Bill 93 proposes 0 fairness, 0 accountability, 0 responsibility, and 0 transparency. We all love kids, and also House Bill 93 is a mistake. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexis. I'm going to invite up our next speaker, Terry Sanders, who is a retired special education teacher from Mountain Home.
I am carrying the Idaho Special Education Manual. I want you to take a look at that for a moment. Good afternoon. I'm Terry Sanders, a retired special education teacher with 34 years of experience. I'm here to speak on behalf of Idaho's special education students. Requesting public funds for private instruction undermines education professionals and students in any and every public school in the state of Idaho. Any special education shortfall affects required services such as occupational therapy and speech-language therapy, physical therapy, special transportation, any services that are required to support special education students. Being a special education teacher is an extremely difficult job. To aid with that job's difficulty, Idaho's Department of Special Education provides a 245-page compliance manual that outlines procedures all special education teachers must implement to support potential students and students with special needs. In addition to this hefty manual, 13 chapters of compliance support is also included. Special education teachers handle implementing state and federal laws such as child find, IDEA, procedural safeguards, and more to ensure fairness, accountability, reasonable timelines, and transparency provided to our students, parents, and general education teachers along with the district. I respectfully request the Idaho legislature review their compliance manual and remind themselves the stability of a Republican form of government depending on mainly upon the intelligence of the people. It shall be the duty of the legislature of Idaho to establish and maintain a general, uniform, and thorough system of public, free, common schools. In closing, rather than placing public money into private schools, please consider fully funding Idaho public education. Thank you for your
Thank you so much. We actually have an additional speaker here. We have Lucy Skopanich representing the United Women in Faith, a statewide Christian organization.
Good afternoon. It's an honor and a privilege to stand here before you. I am Lucy Skopanich, representing United Women in Faith, a statewide Christian organization. United Women in Faith has been following school voucher bills since they were first proposed by our Idaho legislature and find that they are not good for our children, public education, or other public services, no matter how they are written or presented or titled. We believe that parents have the right to select homeschooling or private or parochial schools for their children, which is school choice. But with that personal right comes an obligation to support quality public education for all Idaho children, as stated in our Idaho Constitution. The long-range solution is to improve all Idaho public schools so that families will not be forced to seek other educational alternatives. We as United Women in Faith do affirm our conviction that public funds should be used for public purposes. We also caution that government aid to primary and secondary religious schools raises constitutional problems and could undermine the private schools' independence and compromise their religious message. And this message is taken from our United Methodist Church social principles. Once school vouchers are in place, parents whose children attend private and religious schools will want the voucher tax break for their children. The cost over time then runs into hundreds of millions of dollars, as previously stated by other speakers. The Idaho voucher system then becomes an income distribution system, funneling tax dollars from low-income, mostly rural Idahoans to wealthier families. Over the past 24 years, the legislature has reduced income tax rates by 30%. With the proposal in House Bill 40, the reduction becomes 34.5%. How much increased spending can the state finance with these tax reductions? How will we fund other vital public services when our school voucher program cost balloons? Other states have already gone down this path and have found themselves short on revenue. Public school districts have had to beg for more supplemental property tax levies, further starving public schools and burdening taxpayers. I asked our Idaho legislators, where do the students in your school district go? Nearly half of all counties in Idaho, which is 20 out of the 44, do not contain a single private school, and only 22% of Idaho's 121 private schools are in rural towns. And this is taken from the Idaho League of Women Voters website. So I asked, what are your district's school choices? Is this voucher system really good for your district? Thank you.
Senator James Rucci to do our conclusion, and then we will answer any questions that anybody has, including our media today.
Okay, thank you. I hope you can hang in here for just a couple of more minutes. So, after hearing all this, how can the Idaho House pass such a flawed bill as House Bill 93? And the answer is obvious. They have not heard from the people of Idaho yet. But they will when that bill comes over to the Senate. I have talked to people in rural communities, and you don't just have to take my word for what I'm about to say. There are two other gentlemen with beards on the stage. These sorts of programs are deeply unpopular in rural communities, because in rural communities, they've heard what's happened in other states like Arizona, Florida, Indiana, and Michigan. They've heard about pop-up schools. Pop-up schools, when these voucher programs are created in other states, schools pop up everywhere. They pop up in strip malls, in commercial buildings, anywhere they can go. Why is that? Because there's a race for the money. Anybody who has a business degree or a marketing degree can start a school. They'll worry about the education outcomes later. In rural communities, they've heard about the waste and the fraud and the abuse that goes along with these programs. There's such a hurry to get the money out and to make sure there's no oversight in how it's spent that anybody can use it for their purposes. They've heard about the couple in Arizona that many of you have heard about who used Photoshop to create birth certificates for ghost children. They took the state for $600,000 and were able to escape. It wasn't the state that caught them, it was their credit union. And why didn't the state catch them? Because the state's oversight wasn't robust enough. It didn't have the teeth that it needed. It didn't have the ability to catch people taking money from the state. They've heard about parents buying SeaWorld trips for biology lessons, renting Teslas for driver's training. In rural school districts, their patrons are fiscally conservative. They know they're not going to get the nicest, shiniest school buildings. They know they're not going to get the latest equipment, but they do know they're going to have teachers that care about their kids. They're going to do the best they can. They're going to make their dollars stretch. And frankly, that's the Idaho that we should all expect. We can make our dollars stretch. We can do this for all of us. We're all pooling our resources to make sure this happens. In rural school districts and communities, they recognize instantly the folly of these voucher proposals. They know that millions and millions of dollars are going to flow to private schools and religious schools and away from our public schools. They know that schools in Boise, Nampa, and Coeur d'Alene, private schools and religious schools in Boise, Nampa, and Coeur d'Alene are going to benefit, while public schools in Buell, Rathdrum, and Middleton are going to suffer and have a tough time keeping their doors open. I want to end with this. In the early 1900s, 5 generations ago, my great-great-grandfather came to Pocatello. And he didn't have a lot, but he knew, like most people who came to this state early on, that even though there weren't a lot of resources, if you worked hard and you really dedicated yourself to making a better life for your kids, you could. And part of that was because there was a public education system. Nobody had the money or resources or talent to educate their kids on their own, and so they pooled their resources, taxes, and they said, we'll provide an education for each other, and when I grow old, I'll provide an education for the next generation and the next generation, and so it went, and so it goes today. This bill, these voucher schemes, threaten that system. The system that many in this room have relied on to make sure that you got an education and your kids got an education and your grandkids will get an education. If we let vouchers win, shame on us, because we can stop it. But if we're gonna stop it, we've gotta get going now. We've gotta talk to the senators, you've gotta talk to the governor's office. We have to let them know how important public education is to this state. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much. Thank you to every one of our amazing speakers and all of you who came out today, including our press and everybody who cares so passionately about this issue. Want to open it up for anybody who has questions. I think hopefully everybody here is ready to field a question. Anybody? Oh, yes.
I'm Kayla Dodson and a previous teacher, and I'm wondering something about paying private schools. So the money goes, however much tuition money goes to the private school, and then the private school says, you know, this child is really a challenge, and we don't want him anymore, or her, and go back to where he came from. And do they have to give some of that money back? Tuition
I'm
money?
going to let Representative Yamamoto.
I just want to make sure that you understand that the way 93 is written, it's, I call it hoodwinking, where you say it's one thing, but it's deceptive because it doesn't go directly to the private school, it goes to the parent. And therefore, you can say it isn't going to a private school. But to your point, even on the House floor today, it was said that that money, once it's supposed to be reimbursed, right? But there is a mechanism to get it front-ended if you don't have $5,000 in your pocket. And if that money is spent, I guess it would probably fall to the tax commission and possibly AG Labrador to go tear it out of their hand somehow, or out of their hide, I guess.
Yeah.
I think hoodwinking is an accountant's term.
Yeah. But I think once the tuition has been handed over, I don't think there's no provision in there for how you would claw it back from the school.
Thank you.
So one of the arguments that was made in the hearing in the committee was that when a student leaves public school, then it saves the state, and they quoted like a $9,000 figure or something in that neighborhood that the state doesn't spend. But I know there was another person that testified that talked about the complex funding model. So does that square that tax, that savings?
I guess I'll jump in, and I'm happy to turn it over to anybody here. I think it's a complete myth that that's going to happen. No poor kid is going to suddenly leave public schools and go to a private school with this $5,000. The private school near me is $25,000 a year. It is very wealthy people there. It will still be very wealthy people there. It will be all the same people. They'll just have an extra $5,000 in their pocket. So I really don't believe that we're going to see much transfer of students over, but it certainly will hurt the funding. And we're going to let Rod go up. It certainly hurts every lost student they have from those public schools. Hurts the ability to function.
I was just going to
Jump
say,
up to the
there's a
microphone.
myth.
Yeah, go to the microphone.
There's this myth that they perpetuate that we're going to take all these low-income, vulnerable students and move them over to private religious schools. And people have rightfully talked about the economics of that are not possible. But it is a myth because in every voucher state, without exception, this is a subsidy for families that already send their kids to private school. So this argument that we're going to save all these kids is a myth. This is going to be a subsidy for families that already afford, one way or another, send their kids to Catholic or religious or private schools. So, the more we talk about the transfer of students, the more it perpetuates this myth. So we need to really.
Rod, let me add one thing, just to be really clear. It doesn't just not save money, it increases the budgets. Because you're having families who didn't previously have their kids on the state's budget move over to it, cause now we gotta fund that, so.
Yeah.
Well, and what they were explaining was that the $9,000 that we pay per student will actually go back then, because it's now I'm not spending that $9,000. So it's like, you know, I'm gonna give you $5,000 in tax credit, but I saved you $9,000, so there's a net
Yeah,
$4,000 savings.
We have a
what
superintendent.
Senator says is, and this is really important, what is breaking the budgets in these states is this idea, or it's not an idea, it's happening, that the money's going to families that have never had their kids in public school. That is what's busting the budget in Arizona and these other states. I call it new money. And that's new financial responsibility that the taxpayers of Idaho will be responsible for. So it's a shell game. They're not moving dollars to these private schools. We're subsidizing families that already had it.
So to answer that question, I believe that the dollar amount that they're toting is that they're saving $300 million in the state by families not putting their kids in public schools. And then saying that if those students then leave the public school system, then we're saving the $9,000, and so it's only really costing the state $4,000, or I guess as. However, the funding mechanism of public schools is a lot more complicated than that. It's not a per student spending. One of the things that really irritates me, and you talk about fairness of this, is the state of Idaho funds schools not on enrollment. So when they say that, you know, we have all these kids going to school, then we're funding, you know, $9,000 per student. We get funded on average daily attendance. So when kids get the flu or they get sick, or the parents decide to take them to Disneyland during school days and such, so that attendance then drops. However, I see no accountability in this bill that says if your student only attends 95% of the time, you only get 95% of that $5,000. Completely unfair.
Do any of our media have any questions who are here today of any of our speakers?
I have a few.
Yeah.
Aspen Shumpert, KTV News. A little bit on the attendance-based funding. I think we've heard, you know, we're not grabbing the money directly out of the public school budgets, but like you said, it is attendance-based, and naturally, if students aren't going to your schools, maybe choosing to do the public school route, tell me what that does to your funding.
So if students choose to go somewhere else?
Right, naturally, you know, your attendance is gonna be down, you're gonna have less students if they're going this private school route.
So if attendance drops and such, the units that we get, because that's what we're funded on is units, so attendance drives the units, those units are gonna drop, we're gonna receive less funding than the public schools for sure.
But you still have to keep the lights on, you gotta pay for the teacher that's gonna take care of the other 28 students in the classroom.
And I will say, probably the one thing that won't go away is our highest need students are not gonna be the ones going. We're still gonna be have to pay for those. And right now in Fruitland, and this year is more than last year. Last year, we were $650,000 underfunded in special education. So if I had that money that I had to pull from my discretionary general funds, then I could afford the math curriculum that we need to get, and I wouldn't have to run a levy that is gonna cost the taxpayers of Fruitland an additional $200 a year in property taxes. Schools should not have to run levies in order to meet the basic needs of educating students.
I would point out that this is another area where there is a stark contrast in accountability between public and private schools. Public schools are required to check attendance every single day and account for every student, and if there's a student who's only there 60% of the time, they will only get 60% of the money. For the private school, they can show up 20% of the time and get 100% of the money under House Bill 93. There's no requirement of monitoring attendance and nothing tying the amount of money they get to whether a student is actually present.
And you answered my second question of, does that mean relying on you know, property taxes, and maybe that's not necessarily what's supposed to be happening. I've heard during my discussions with some of the sponsors of these school choice bills, when I've asked that question about if our school districts are supposed to be relying on property taxes, they have responded and said, well, that doesn't really necessarily have anything to do with my bill. What would be your response to the maybe constant claims that this isn't affecting public schools.
So, they say that this doesn't take a single dollar from public schools, and you're right now, however, if you're taking $50 million of public tax dollars and giving it to education by not giving it to public schools, that is costing public schools. And if we're ignoring the fact, special education and facilities are the two biggest budget items that are busting the budgets of school districts, and especially in rural school districts. I mean, unless we're gonna take this seriously and say, okay, if we're spending a single dime, dollar, or whatever goes from the taxpayers of Idaho to education, it better be to public education, and we better be serving the most needing students that we have, and that is our special education population. And right now, no one's taking that seriously.
I'm a special education teacher, and I would like to back up what he's saying with this fact. Our private schools, those students still can access special education through the public schools. I, as a special education teacher, have had to assess and write IEPs for students who are in the private school. That means that if they are receiving these funds, they are double dipping.
Oh!
Let me just hit on that real quick. So I served in the legislature from 2006 to 10, which means I was here during the Great Recession. And first, might be 50 million this year, but over time we know these budgets balloon. So in the next several years, it could be 300 million, 400 million, wherever it's going to go. In 2009, when revenues shrank, we had to figure out how to make the budget balance, because we have to balance our budget. Well, guess where we did it? We cut budgets, and we cut them deep. And when 60% of your budget goes towards public education, that's where you're gonna go to cut budgets and make the budget balance. It took us until 2019 to get back to the spending levels we were doing in 2003 or 4. My point is this: if you're creating a separate voucher system, separate public education system that's voucher-based, and you have your traditional, and the budgets are ballooning, and then you go through a recession, and guess what? We will have another recession someday. Those two budgets are gonna eat each other, because they're gonna be desperate for the same dollars. And when they do, that means rural school districts are not gonna have the money that they had. And when they don't have it, who do they go to? They go to their local taxpayers and ask them to pay some more taxes so they can get the same services, which very literally means in order to send a family's kid to a private school in Meridian, people in rural school districts are paying more taxes. That is wrong.
Several of you talked about the next steps in this process, either the Senate, the governor's office, a veto, sustaining a veto. How realistic do you think your prospects are at any step of that process going forward?
Well, I guess my question off the cuff is that it depends on the people of Idaho. The people in this building want to get reelected. If they hear from their people, this is a fundamentally very unpopular proposal, and I think the more people learn about it, the less they like it. The question is, are they going to write to their legislators? Are they going to show up, testify, call in? I believe that if these senators hear from enough of their constituents that they are not happy with this can be defeated in the Senate, and it can absolutely, as mentioned earlier, we could absolutely sustain a veto on it. The governor made some statements at the beginning of the session about what threshold a voucher or quote school choice bill would have to meet. There is no planet on which House Bill 93 meets those standards. So if he is going to be true to that promise, he should veto this bill. This is, again, if the people of Idaho flood his inbox, he has vetoed things before when he heard from thousands of people calling in and writing in. And this is one where he's already kind of laid the Easter eggs that this is something he should veto if he's going to be true to his principles on this. But it is very much going to be in the hands of the people, and being very, very vocal, because their future is very much on the line with this bill. But we know we can sustain a veto. We saw it on the floor today. We needed 24 votes to sustain a veto. We got 28. We are comfortably in the range of being able to sustain a veto if the governor is willing to stand by what he stated at the beginning of session.
That deserves a clap for sure. To your question, what I would say is that whatever whatever your district is in, you need to go back into your clerk's office numbers and look at the primary and look at how many people, for example, in District 11, about 1,300 votes put the person in place who feels like that he has a mandate and that he's we the people. 1,300 people out of 55,000 people. So it tells you that if all that happens are those 1,300 let him know, good job, dude, you're doing what we want you to do, then he's gonna keep doing what he's doing. But if you have thousands of people who start calling, and not form letters, make it count. Say it in your own words. Be authentic about, you know, how you would say that, and just let them know. And the Senate's the same. Look, you only have one senator. That's where we are now. So look to see what was that vote count, and then you better be calling your neighbors and everyone else that you know to say, this is the time. If it matters at all, it matters now.
Yes.
Yeah.
We have a shot at beating this in the Senate. It's fiscally irresponsible. You need to reach out to your senators at this point.
Any other questions? Yeah.
I have a question. So usually when there's a tax credit, the item that you're purchasing goes up in accordance with the tax credit. Have you seen that in states that have vouchers that the cost of these private schools go up?
24%.
Yes. Yes, definitely. I'll use an example. I've written about this. There's a parish in St. Petersburg, Florida. Tampa Bay Times has written about this. When the universal vouchers came out, Monsignor sent a signal to every parishioner who sent their kids to school to file for a voucher. Then he raised the tuition, cut it slightly for the parent, and took, I think it's $8,000 from the state. He was netting about $1 million more a year for his parish than he was before the vouchers. And that is happening in schools, religious schools across the country. So yes, they are raising tuition, taking the tax money, and actually doing pretty darn well. It's a subsidy for their schools.
Okay, well, I think, anyone else of our press here, any questions before we wrap it up? We want to thank you all again so much for coming here. Time is of the essence. We have maybe, 1 to 2 weeks to beat this thing. So let's flood the zone. Let's email the governor, write the governor, show up. We will have an opportunity in the Senate committee to come testify. Just make your voices heard, because it would be really unfortunate if we weren't able to stop this thing. Thank you so much.